Fog slithered through the ancient trees of the Appalachian forest like pale, icy fingers, clinging tightly to every dry pine branch. The wind howled in gusts, cutting through the thick mist, carrying a blend of life and death. Rustling leaves, distant owl hoots, and somewhere, a faint moan, fragile as the final breath of a tiny creature struggling in the dark. Sophie Thompson, 16, stood before the fogged-up window of the small wooden cabin, her deep blue eyes flickering with unease. She couldn't explain it. A sharp instinct, like a blade scraping inside her chest, had gripped her since the first streaks of dawn painted the sky pink. Something was wrong. The forest was crying out. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. She laced up her old hiking boots, each tug of the strings a fight to suppress the invisible fear gnawing at her. Inside the cabin, the damp smell of wood mingled with the warm aroma of cocoa from the mug her father, Mark, had left on the table. He emerged from the kitchen corner, his tall, lean frame toughened by 2 decades as a ranger in Jefferson National Forest, his hands rough and calloused. "Heading out this early, kiddo?" His voice was low and warm, but his eyes were sharp, as if he too sensed something off beyond the walls. Sophie nodded, lips pressed tight. "I want to check the Eastern Trail before school. Yesterday it felt off." She couldn't put it into words, just a feeling, like when the birds went silent mid-forest or the air grew heavy before a storm. Mark frowned, the lines on his forehead deepening. "You noticed it too?" "I've had reports of suspicious activity in that area. Be careful, you hear?" Sophie gave a half smirk, part jest, part defiance. "I know, Dad. Stay alert, keep the radio on, don't mess with strangers. I've been doing this since I was 12, but Mark's eyes didn't soften. Don't get cocky. 3 strange vehicles in the eastern sector this week alone. Something's not right." His words pricked her confidence like a needle, but Sophie hid it. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, packed with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and the camera she cherished like an extension of herself. Then she stepped outside, leaving her father's worried sigh to fade into the creak of the closing wooden door. The air outside was frigid, seeping through her thick jacket, creeping into every pore. The fog wrapped around her like a living shroud, blurring the towering trees in the distance. The Eastern Trail wound through the deep woods, where wild bushes sprawled and moss-covered rocks formed perfect dens for animals. Sophie loved this place. The cheerful chirping of birds each morning, the earthy scent after rain, the secrets the forest whispered through every branch. But this morning, the woods were eerily silent. No birds, no squirrels darting by. Only the crunch of her boots on dry leaves echoed like a drumbeat in the stillness. Her father had once told her, "When the forest goes quiet, it's afraid." And now she felt that fear, not her own, but the forest's. 20 minutes in, she stopped, her breath forming white puffs in the cold air. Before her in the soft dirt beside the trail was a deep tire track, sharp and fresh as if carved moments ago. Her heart pounded harder. This area was off limits to vehicles. Only ranger trucks were allowed, and they never came this way. Someone had broken the rules on purpose. She knelt, hands trembling as she pulled out her camera. The lens aimed at the track like it could capture proof of a crime yet unseen. Weak light pierced the fog, glinting off the winding mark that stretched deeper into the woods. "Who was here?" she whispered, her voice lost in the empty space. Then she heard it. A small, faint sound, sharp as a knife cutting through the fog. A cry, not a bird, not the wind, but the sound of something in pain, calling for help. It came from deep within the forest, where thick bushes blocked out all light. Sophie shot to her feet, her heart hammering, each beat urging her forward. She glanced at her watch. Time was short before she had to head back for school. But that cry wouldn't let her leave. It pulled her, dragged her, like an invisible thread tightening around her heart. She veered off the trail, thorny branches snagging her jacket, pricking her skin, but she didn't care. The cry grew louder, clearer, and now she knew it wasn't like any familiar forest sound. It was like a child sobbing, but wilder, more desperate. The bushes ahead were dense, mountain laurel leaves trembling as if hiding something. Then she saw it, a figure fleeting through the fog, wearing camouflage that wasn't ranger gear. Her heart caught in her throat. She ducked behind an old oak, breath ragged, clutching the radio like it was her only weapon. Through the leaves, she saw more. A man, scruffy-bearded, knelt on the ground, shoving something into a large canvas sack. The cry came again, this time from the sack itself, weak but distinct. Sophie's blood ran cold. It was a bobcat, a cub, tiny, trapped. She'd seen drawings of them on the cabin walls, heard her father talk of bobcats poached for their beautiful, illegal pelts. But this wasn't a drawing, not a story. This was real, alive, and terrifying, unfolding right before her eyes. Where was its mother? The thought flashed, cold as the wind whipping past. If the cub was here, its mother should be close. Unless, she didn't dare finish the thought. Her hand gripped the radio, thumb hovering over the call button, but she hesitated. Call Dad now and he'd come, but this man would vanish, taking the cub and his awful secret with him. She couldn't let that happen. Her breath shook, but her eyes blazed with fierce resolve, forged from the days her father taught her to protect the woods, from the nights she cried over trapped animals' bodies. She wasn't just a 16-year-old girl, she was a guardian of this forest, and she wouldn't let it down. She took a deep breath, stood, and stepped out from the tree's raven. Dim light fell on her tangled brown hair, her fists clenched as if ready to fight. Ahead, the poacher looked up, his eyes darkening as they met hers. The cry from the sack sounded again, like a final plea, and in that moment, Sophie knew everything was about to change, forever. The fog clung stubbornly to the Appalachian forest, wrapping around Sophie's figure like an invisible, icy cloak. She stepped out from behind the oak, her legs trembling but steady, her gaze locked straight on the poacher. He stood there, less than 10 steps away, towering in mud-streaked camouflage, his strong hands gripping a rough canvas sack. From within it, the faint cry of the bobcat cub pierced the air again, small but sharp, like a needle stabbing into her heart. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowing, sweeping over her as if she were a lost little animal. The air between them grew heavy, taut like a string about to snap. Sophie heard the blood rushing in her ears, but she didn't back down. She couldn't back down. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "This is a restricted area. I need to see your permit." The words came out sharp, echoing through the fog, but inside she was screaming. Who was he? What had he done to the cub's mother? Did he have a knife? She darted a quick glance at his hands. No steel glinted, but those rough fists could crush anything as small as the creature in the sack. He smirked, a crooked grin revealing yellow teeth. "Just out for a morning stroll, kid. Didn't see any signs saying it's off limits." His voice was gravelly, laced with mockery, but his eyes flickered, as if calculating an escape. Sophie straightened, though her hands shook so hard in her pockets, she had to clutch the radio to hide it. "There's a sign at the trailhead," she shot back, her tone cold as mountain stone. "And what about that sack? I hear something. What are you hiding?" The cry came again, weaker now, like a final plea from the tiny bobcat. He tightened his grip on the sack, knuckles whitening, a flash of menace in his eyes. "None of your business, kid. Go to school and stop poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Anger flared in Sophie, hot and fierce, drowning out her fear. Grown-ups. Who did he think she was? She wasn't just a 16-year-old with a backpack and a camera. She was Mark Thompson's daughter, taught to read animal tracks in the mud, to hear the wind's warnings, to stand up when the forest needed her most. She remembered nights by the kitchen table, her father recounting tales of trapped animals, his eyes red as he mourned creatures that never made it back to their dens. She remembered her first photo, an abandoned fawn, and the silent vow she'd made. She wouldn't let the forest die again. "I'm a junior ranger," she declared, pulling her ID from her pocket and holding it up. "And everything to do with wildlife here is my business. You're breaking the law. I've got photographic evidence." She raised her camera, hands still trembling, but her voice held steady. It was a blatant lie. She hadn't captured his face, just the tire tracks. But she knew the power of a bluff. He frowned, stepping forward, his hulking frame blocking the faint light filtering through the fog. "You're making that up," he growled, his voice dropping like a predator's. "No one's out here this early." Sophie swallowed hard, a chill racing down her spine. He was half right. No one knew she was here. Not yet. But she couldn't let him see her fear. Not now. "You're wrong," she replied, her finger brushing the radio's call button. "This is my regular patrol route. My dad, the head ranger, is expecting my check-in right now." Another lie, but this one landed perfectly. The radio crackled to life, Mark's voice cutting through. "Sophie, check in. You done yet?" It sliced the air like a blade, strong and clear, and to Sophie, it was a beacon in the dark. The poacher flinched, his eyes wavering, his grip on the sack loosening. She seized the moment, her voice rising. "Drop the sack and leave now, or I'll call the rangers and police. They'll be here in 10 minutes. Time seemed to freeze. He stared at her, eyes blazing with anger and doubt. She stood there, small against him, but her gaze burned like a fire he couldn't extinguish. 1 second, 2. Then with a hoarse curse, he flung the sack to the ground and bolted into the bushes. Twigs snapped as he vanished into the fog, leaving Sophie alone, her breath ragged, her heart pounding like it might burst. She'd won, but it wasn't over. She dropped to her knees beside the sack, her shaking hands fumbling with the ties. The damp scent of earth and fur hit her, mingling with a tiny, fading cry. Inside, a bobcat cub lay curled into a small ball of fur, its golden eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Its spotted coat was matted with mud, its tiny body trembling. It couldn't be more than a few weeks old, too small to survive alone. "Oh God," Sophie whispered, her voice catching. "Where'd you come from?" She glanced around, hoping to spot its mother somewhere in the woods, but only fog and silence answered. A new fear surged. If the mother wasn't here, what had he done? The thought twisted in her chest like a knife. She hovered her hand near the cub, not touching, just letting it feel her warmth. "Don't be scared," she said, her voice soft as a lullaby. "I'll help you." But in her mind, a question gnawed. Could it survive? She grabbed the radio, pressing the call button hard. "Dad, get to marker E7 now. I found an abandoned bobcat cub. The poacher ran toward the old logging road." Her voice was urgent but steady, as if she'd shoved all her fear aside for resolve. Mark's reply came instantly. "Stay put. I'm on my way. Don't touch it unless you have to." Sophie nodded to herself, her eyes fixed on the cub. It stared back, its golden gaze weak but alive, like a tiny flame refusing to die. She heard the stream nearby, its gurgling blending with the cub's shaky breaths. The poacher was gone, but the real fight was just beginning. She didn't know if she could save it, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't give up. Never. The fog still hung around the Appalachian forest, but now it was no longer a veil of mystery. It was the cold breath of waiting. Sophie knelt beside the small stream, its shimmering surface reflecting her deep blue eyes, now brimming with worry. Before her, the bobcat cub lay curled in the open sack, its mud-matted, spotted fur trembling with each faint breath. The stream's gurgle blended with its ragged gas, a wordless, mournful melody. She didn't dare touch it, didn't dare do anything but whisper, "Hang on, little one. Dad's coming soon." But inside she was afraid that each breath it took might be its last. She gazed into the cub's golden eyes, wide but clouded, like gems dulled by pain and exhaustion. It was so small, tiny enough to cradle in her hands, but it didn't belong there. It belonged to the forest, to deep stone dens, to its mother who was nowhere in sight. The thought struck again, icy as the water beside her. What had the poacher done to its mother? She pictured a strong, majestic bobcat caught in a steel trap or felled by a gunshot. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms, trying to banish the image. Number. She had to focus. She had to save this little one first. The distant rustle of dry leaves broke the silence. followed by the urgent thud of footsteps. Mark emerged through the fog, his tall frame clad in a ranger uniform, his weathered face etched with worry and anger. He knelt beside Sophie, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the scene. "God Almighty," he whispered, his voice low and rough. "It's so small." He glanced at the sack, then the cub, then her. "You did good, Sophie, but it's in bad shape." His words stabbed her heart, but his gaze softened, as if to say he believed she'd done all she could. Sophie nodded, fighting to keep her voice steady as tears welled up. "I found it in the sack. The poacher left it. I didn't see its mom anywhere, Dad. I think he..." She couldn't finish, but Mark understood. He rested a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently, the warmth of his calloused palm seeping through her jacket. "We'll figure that out later. Right now, this little one needs us." He pulled a specialized carrier from his pack, his tone shifting to command. "Get it in here, easy now. We've got to get it home fast." They worked together, careful as surgeons in an operating room. Sophie gently lifted the sack while Mark slid the carrier beneath. The cub let out a faint cry, so weak it was almost inaudible, and her heart clenched. Once it was safely inside, Mark stood, his voice urgent. "To the truck. We're out of time." Sophie clutched the carrier to her chest, running after her father through the woods, the fog swirling around them as if reluctant to let them go. The stream faded into the distance, but the cub's breaths echoed in her ears, each one a reminder. It was alive, but not safe yet. In the truck, Sophie sat in the back, the carrier on her lap. She peered through the mesh, seeing the cub curled tight, its eyes half closed. "Hang on, little one," she whispered, her voice quivering. "You're so strong." Mark drove, hands gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the bumpy trail home. "It's been starved," he said, his tone low but certain. "Dehydrated too. We need to call the vet as soon as we're back." Sophie nodded, but a question gnawed at her. "Dad, if its mom's gone, why'd he leave it? Why not take it too?" Mark glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes darkening. "Maybe you interrupted him, or he didn't want the cub, just the mother's pelt." His words hit her like a punch. She looked down at the cub, imagining it alone in the woods, waiting for a mother that would never return. She remembered days patrolling with her dad, him showing her how to track, how to save injured animals. But she'd never felt this helpless. "I don't want it to die," she whispered, too quiet for anyone but herself. Mark turned his head slightly, his voice softening. "I know, kiddo. Neither do I. You've given it a chance. Now we've got to do the rest." Back at the cabin, they turned the mudroom into a makeshift sanctuary. Mark spread soft blankets and set the carrier down while Sophie dashed for water and a clean cloth. She recalled her father's rule. Don't touch wild animals unless you must. But seeing the cub tremble, she couldn't stand it. She dipped the cloth in water, wrung it gently, and held it near its mouth. A drop fell, then another. The cub licked feebly, its tiny tongue brushing the fabric. "Good job," she whispered, her eyes lighting with hope. Mark called the vet, his voice urgent. "We need a formula now. It won't make it through the night without food." The vet guided them over the phone to mix milk from emergency powder rangers kept on hand. Sophie stood at the kitchen counter, hands shaking as she measured spoonfuls while Mark warmed water. They worked in silence, only the ticking clock and the cub's faint breaths breaking the quiet. When the mixture was ready, Sophie took a small syringe, carefully dripping it into the cub's mouth. It swallowed slowly, each drop a tiny victory. "You've got this," she said, her voice thick. "You're a fighter." Mark sat beside her, his eyes gentle but raven with concern. "Skip school today, okay?" Sophie nodded, never looking away from the cub. "I have to stay. It needs me." He gave a small smile, though it didn't hide his worry. "You're more like me than you know," he said, his voice lowering. "But don't let it pull you in too deep. It's wild, Sophie. If it survives, it'll have to go back to the forest." She nodded, but inside she didn't want to think about that. Not now. Night fell, the cabin sinking into stillness, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Sophie sat by the carrier, syringe in hand, eyes locked on the cub. Its breathing steadied, though still weak, and she named it in her mind. Raven, for its smallness, for surviving the dark, for slipping into her life like an unshakable raven. She didn't know if Raven would make it through the night, but she knew one thing. She'd fight with it, breath by breath. Outside, the fog still blanketed the forest, but in this room, a fragile spark of hope flickered, faint but unextinguished. Early spring sunlight filtered through the canopy of the Appalachian forest, casting shimmering streaks across the wooden floor of the small cabin. Inside the mudroom, now Raven's temporary domain, Sophie sat cross-legged, her blue eyes lighting up as she watched the bobcat cub, once so fragile, now grown stronger, more robust. Raven's spotted coat gleamed like starlight, each strand alive with the vitality she and her father had fought to preserve through long days. It was no longer a trembling ball of fur. Raven was a true bobcat now, small but sturdy, its golden eyes blazing with wild instinct. She smiled, but the smile carried a thread of sorrow. She knew this day would come, the day she'd have to let go. Those first weeks had been brutal. Raven was so weak that every drop of milk was a battle, every breath a miracle. Sophie had skipped countless school days, sitting by the carrier for hours, whispering to it, reading aloud, from her dad's biology books to poems she scribbled in her journal. She remembered the first night Raven truly looked at her, its eyes locking onto hers as if it knew she'd pulled it from the darkness. Mark had stood there, arms crossed, pride and worry mingling in his gaze. "You've done great," he'd said, his voice warm and low. "But it's not a pet, Sophie. It's wild." She'd nodded, but her heart hadn't wanted to hear it. Not then. Time passed, and Raven grew under her care. She called it Raven, not just for the dark night she'd found it, but because it followed her like one. Silent, curious, yet always keeping a wild distance. She started training it in the backyard, where a wooden fence separated it from the world beyond. She tossed toy mice, threw balls, watched its tiny claws rake the dirt, its young growl ringing out like a declaration. "I belong to the forest." Mark helped, bringing logs for Raven to climb, teaching her to keep her distance so it wouldn't grow too tame. "It needs to hunt," he'd said, "needs to fear us." But every time Raven sat close, tilting its head as she read, her heart melted. She studied relentlessly, books on bobcats, articles on releasing wildlife, calls with experts. She learned the signs of readiness, when it refused milk, when it growled at strangers, when its golden eyes shone with independence. But knowing and accepting were different beasts. Night after night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, picturing Raven racing through the deep woods, strong and free. Then she'd cry, quietly, because she didn't want to lose it, didn't want to lose the little Raven that had become part of her. Mark saw that pain. One evening, as Raven ate its first meat, a small mouse he'd brought home, he sat beside her. "You've done something amazing, Sophie," he said, gentle but firm. "But it doesn't belong here. You know that." She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "I know, Dad, but letting it go, it's like leaving a piece of me behind." He hugged her, the warmth of his arms all she needed then. "That's real love," he whispered, giving it freedom, no matter how much it hurts. The day to release Raven came faster than she'd expected. The vet checked it one last time, nodding with approval. "It's healthy. Ready." They chose a deep valley in the preserve, far from trails, far from human ravens. That morning, Sophie stood in the kitchen, hands trembling as she packed. Camera, water, one last piece of meat for Raven. Mark patted her shoulder. "Let's go, kiddo." She nodded, hugging Raven's carrier one final time before loading it into the truck. On the drive, she said nothing, just watched Raven through the mesh, its golden eyes meeting hers, calm but piercing. Night fell as they reached the valley. The moon hung high, silver white, bathing the dark forest in light. An owl's eerie call echoed somewhere, blending with the wind whistling through the leaves. Sophie set the carrier on the ground, her hands ice cold, her heart pounding. Mark stood back, silent, letting her do it alone. She knelt, peering at Raven through the mesh. "This is your home," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have to go." She opened the door, slowly, shaking. Raven stepped out, slow, cautious, its ears perked, nose sniffing the air. It stood there small but solid, its fur glinting under the moonlight. Then it turned, looked at her. Those golden eyes cut through her, as if trying to say something. Sophie's breath caught. She remembered nights it lay beside her, the soft growls when she scratched its head, the first time it leapt onto the table to steal meat. It all flooded back, vivid, agonizing. "Go," she whispered, tears spilling over. "You belong here." Raven blinked, once, then bolted, fast, powerful. Its paws hit the ground, its small form darting into the bushes. Sophie collapsed. The earth was freezing, her heart shattered. It ran, stopped, turned back, looked at her one last time. Its golden eyes flashed in the dark, then vanished. The rustle of leaves faded, leaving her in silence. She sobbed, clutching her chest. Pain, pride, loss, all swirled together. Mark stepped forward, knelt beside her, and pulled her into a tight hug. "You did it," he said, his voice trembling. "It'll be okay because of you." She nodded, tears soaking his shirt. "I hope so," she whispered. "I just want it to live." They stood walking back to the truck, the moon still glowing above, as if witnessing Raven's return to the wild. Sophie glanced back, one last look at the darkness where it disappeared. She didn't know if Raven would remember her, but she knew she'd never forget it. On the ride home, she held her camera, fingers brushing the shutter. She hadn't taken that final shot, didn't need to. Raven under the moonlight was etched in her heart, forever. But deep down, a question lingered. Would it really be okay? Would the forest embrace it as she had? She had no answers. Not yet. Rain fell softly through the canopy of the Appalachian forest, each drop pattering onto the ground, soaking into the dry leaves and forming tiny circles in the mud. A year had passed since that moonlit night, the night Sophie released Raven back into the deep woods. Now she stood on the eastern trail, her hiking boots scuffing the wet earth, her heavy backpack slung over her shoulder. At 17, she was a little taller, her brown hair tied back neatly, but her blue eyes still shone. Not with the light of a girl who saved an animal, but with the fire of a protector, a warrior for the forest she loved. Her camera dangled at her hip, her hand gripping the radio as Mark's voice crackled through. "Sophie, head back soon. It's about to pour." She smiled, pressing the button to reply. "I know, Dad. Just one last check." She didn't tell him the real reason. It wasn't a routine patrol. It wasn't junior ranger duty. She was here because of a feeling, an instinct tugging her back to where it all began. The stream's gurgle, the confrontation with the poacher, the moment she found Raven. The past year had changed her. After releasing Raven, she'd thrown herself into wildlife conservation with a burning passion. She started a protection group at school, gave talks on poaching, worked with her dad to beef up patrols in the eastern sector. Raven's story spread, from Mark's retellings to her speech before hundreds of students, igniting interest in the community. But to Sophie, it wasn't just a story. It was part of her soul, a beautiful scar she carried. The rain grew heavier, soaking through her jacket, chilling her skin. She walked slowly, eyes scanning the forest for signs, tracks, fur, anything. She didn't know what she hoped for. Was Raven still alive? Had it found its way in the wild? She'd let it go with hope, but there were no guarantees. The forest was beautiful, but cruel. She remembered nights after the release, dreaming of Raven racing through the trees, strong and free, only to wake with a tear-soaked pillow. She never told Mark, but he knew. He always did. She stopped by the stream, its flow stronger from the rain, the sounds stirring memories of that day. She knelt, touching the wet earth, as if to feel the forest breath. Then she saw it, a footprint in the mud, small but clear, sharp claws etched deep. Her heart pounded. Bobcat. She pulled out her camera, hands shaking as she snapped a shot, the lens fogging with rain. She stood, following the tracks, stepping lightly as if afraid to shatter something fragile. They led through the bushes to a small clearing where the rain thinned under thick branches. And then she saw it. Through the faint drizzle, a bobcat stood there, less than 10 yards away. Its black spotted fur glistened with water, its body solid, far bigger than the tiny raven she'd once held. Golden eyes met hers, blazing, cutting through space and time. Sophie's breath caught. "Raven?" she whispered, her voice lost in the rain. It didn't move, just stood, ears perked, nose sniffing. She wasn't sure it was him, couldn't be sure. But those eyes, she'd know them anywhere, like the small flame she'd cradled through long nights. She didn't step closer, didn't call again. She just stood, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears. It was alive, it was strong, it was king of this forest, as she dreamed. Raven, if it was him, tilted its head, its gaze quiet but profound. A moment stretched, long as a year. Then it flicked its tail, a gentle wave, not a pet's greeting to its owner, but a wild creature's nod to the one who'd saved it. It turned, stepped into the bushes, vanished. The rustle of leaves faded, leaving her in the rain, in silence. Sophie knelt, touching the last footprint it left. She cried, but not from sadness, from joy, from pride, from knowing she'd done right. She pulled out her camera, snapped the print, raindrops blurring the lens. She didn't need a perfect picture. She had it in her heart. Raven, powerful, free, alive. She stood wiping her face, smiling through the rain. "Goodbye again," she whispered, her voice light as the breeze. On the way back, she stayed silent on the radio, letting Mark worry a little. At home, she sat at the table, opened her journal, and taped the photo of the footprint inside. Beneath it, she wrote, "Raven, 1 year later. He's home." She didn't know if it remembered her, didn't know if that look was gratitude or instinct. She didn't need to know. What she knew was that it lived, and their story had inspired her to keep going. She'd go to college, become a biologist, protect other ravens in the deep woods. That was the promise she made to herself in the rain that day. The rain stopped as she closed the journal, gazing out the window. The forest stretched before her, green and mysterious. Somewhere in that darkness, Raven still roamed, its golden eyes glinting like a flame that never died. Did it remember her? Would it ever return here? She had no answers, but she had hope. And that hope, along with the footprint in the rain, was enough to carry her forward. The forest lived, Raven lived, and a piece of her would always be out there, among the trees with him. And so the tale of Sophie and Raven draws to a close beneath the gentle rain of the Appalachian forest, where each droplet soaks into the earth, mirroring the hope that seeps into the heart of a young girl who changed the fate of one tiny creature. From that fateful day when Sophie stood up to a poacher to save Raven, to the moment she set it free into the wild, and then saw it again, maybe standing tall as a survivor. It's a beautiful cycle of courage, love, and freedom. But this story isn't just theirs. It's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference for the wild world out there. Want to dive into more heart-stirring journeys like this? Hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel right now. Every week we bring you fresh stories, stunning moments from nature, and powerful lessons to help protect our planet together. Don't miss out. Join us and keep the flame of hope burning bright.